we've had a really high number of aftershocks. I think some 58 in the 4 hours
Really?
since the main earthquake, and two of those have been magnitude 6 or higher. So authorities are warning basically that, the aftershocks is probably the major risk to people now, and they're likely to continue in the coming days too.
Officials in Taiwan say at least 4 people have died after the nation was struck by its most powerful earthquake for 25 years. We can speak to James Chater in the Taiwanese capital of Taipei. He's the East Asia correspondent for DW News. Morning to you, James.
Hi there, how are you?
Very good, thank you. What was it like then? You were there, presumably, when it happened. How did it feel?
Yeah, I mean, I've lived in Taiwan for 5 years now, and this is definitely the biggest earthquake I felt since living here. It struck just before 8 a.m. this morning in my flat. Tables were kind of knocked over. I'm in the capital, Taipei, as you mentioned. This is a place where shaking was pretty strong, but not as bad as the worst affected areas in Hualien, which is on the east coast of Taiwan. That's where the images kind of coming up on social media right now are a bit more troubling. There's been some pretty big landslides, and the 4 deaths you mentioned there have been reported in that part of Taiwan. Also, we expect so far 50 people injured, more than 50 people injured, but that's likely to increase in the coming hours as a kind of true scale of the destruction and damage, is particularly in that east part of Taiwan, becomes clear.
And what sort of thing are we talking about there? Is that I've seen some pretty shocking landslides. Is that where the concern is? Is it landslides? Is it buildings falling down? Where is it worst?
Yeah, well, I think the majority of the deaths have taken place in that slightly more. This is quite a mountainous area. So one of the deaths, for example, was a hiker who was out on one of the routes and was killed by a falling rock. In the cities, it's mostly that kind of destruction of buildings. There's images of some buildings which have been essentially moved to about a 45-degree angle from the road because the ground essentially just gave way underneath them. That's where we're also hearing that some people are still trapped in some of those buildings. There were tsunami warnings issued in the immediate aftermath of the earthquake. Those seem to have been withdrawn now by authorities, not just in Taiwan actually, but also in Japan and the Philippines too. So the impact of tsunamis is unlikely to kind of cause much damage. But the other thing that's happened, honestly, in the last 5 hours or so since the earthquake struck, is we've had a really high number of aftershocks. I think some 58 in the 4 hours
Really?
since the main earthquake, and two of those have been magnitude 6 or higher. So authorities are warning basically that, the aftershocks is probably the major risk to people now, and they're likely to continue in the coming days too.
And what do you do then in that situation, James? Do you have to stay? Where do you go for safety, or do you just think that you just have to risk it with aftershocks? What do you do?
Yeah, well, I think people have pretty good knowledge and understanding of this type of situation in Taiwan. It's something that happens quite frequently. If you're on a low enough building, people try and exit the building as fast as possible. Sometimes that's not the case. Fortunately, in Taiwan, because they are so used to this type of event happening, the majority of buildings, almost all buildings now, have very strict regulations about earthquake proofing. So that's why we haven't seen, the large scale infrastructure damage and architectural damage in Taipei, for example. Most of those buildings are designed to withstand earthquakes of even stronger magnitude. Outside in kind of smaller cities, that's sometimes a bit more challenging. But yeah, I have to say, I've experienced quite a few earthquakes here in Taiwan now, and it's something that you never really get used to. It's a pretty terrifying experience. There's not much. You feel quite helpless in the situation because you don't know how long it's going to go on for. This one was quite a shallow earthquake, so the level of shaking was even stronger. And it lasted for quite a long time too. Actually, the level of shaking, I think it was a 7.2 in Taiwan. That level of shaking means it's sometimes quite difficult to even walk
Yeah.
around your flat. So it's yeah, not a pleasant experience.
And just finally, Taiwan is now best known, I suppose, around the world for its role in the global economy. It's a big chip manufacturer. It's the heart of the tech industry, really. Presumably, because of the infrastructure you talked about, it's able to carry on going with its industry with life because the buildings are well protected. It's good at keeping going. Is that true of Taiwan? Do you think?
Yeah, that's fair to say. And one of the first things people kind of journalists do in the immediate aftermath of situations like this is reach out to the semiconductor
Yeah.
companies produce some 90% of the world's most advanced chips. You know, if that production facility gets shut down, that could actually have pretty wide-reaching ramifications for the global economy. TSMC, this is the biggest, the world's most advanced producer of semiconductors, has said there was a brief period where they had to evacuate some of their factories in Taiwan, but they are broadly running as usual. I mean, I imagine those buildings are some of the most earthquake-proof because the implications not just for Taiwan's economy but for the global economy are pretty drastic in that situation. But so far with this earthquake, it seems they've managed to keep things under control.
Well, James, look after yourself. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us.
No worries.
That's James Chater there in the Taiwanese capital of Taipei. 4 are dead outside of the capital, as you're saying, on the coast, and aftershocks are continuing.